My integrative art lessons all had to do with this painting called Skating in Central Park by Agnes Tate. And all of my lessons had to do with second grade. And so I had a social studies lesson, a language arts lesson, a math, and a science lesson. So my social studies lesson was tied to an art history standard component, and it was about how it tied to the standard which said, describe how the regions in which historical figures in Georgia lived affected their lives and compare these regions to the region in which students live. So I talked about how the artist Agnes Tate grew up in New York City, and so Central Park was a part of who she was and where she grew up. So that influenced her work of art. So I had the students recall that we had already learned about historical figures in Georgia like James Oglethorpe, Jackie Robinson, Martin Luther King Jr., Juliette Gordon Low, and Jimmy Carter. And so I made a PowerPoint and we went through each person kind of as a refresher and where they were from in Georgia. And then just like how Agnes Tate's environment and where she lived influenced and affected her works of art, so did where these historic figures grew up. It affected who they were and the accomplishments that they made. So I had the students talking partners about how the region in which Martin Luther King Jr. grew up affected his life. And then we kind of came together as a class and wrote our findings on the board. Then I told them to pick another person who was mentioned earlier besides Martin Luther King Jr. and write 3 sentences or statements on how the region that they lived in affected their lives. So that was like the first part of the lesson, was to talk about how the region in which another historical figure lived affected their lives or had an effect on their lives. And then I wanted them to write 3 sentences or statements on how the region in which they lived affected their own life. And so then they were to draw a picture on their paper that portrays their personal statements. And then once they were finished, they were just to share their statements and their picture at their table group and compare each other's statements. And then for the assessments, I have a kind of like a rubric that is total to 10 points. And to get all 10 points, they needed to have 3 accurate statements on how the region that their historical figure lived affected the historical figure's life, 3 accurate statements on how the region that they live in affected their own life, and then 2 points for accurately drawing a picture of the region that they live in and aspects that affected their lives, and then 2 points for the table talk discussion and a good compare and contrast statement between each other. So that was the studies lesson. Next was the language arts lesson that had to do with art aesthetics. So that was the art component that was tied in with the lesson. So the language arts lesson, we started out with looking at the painting. And so I had the students look at the people in the painting and kind of ask them, who do you think that they're with? You know, they may be with their family or their friends. And then I would ask them if they've ever enjoyed a winter activity with family and friends, and what did they do? So I'd have them kind of like turn and share with someone on what they did and how it made them feel, and just kind of like how their day and activity went. Then I asked the students to write a narrative about their wintertime activity experience. I wanted to make sure that they used a lot of detail and told the story in order with a clear beginning, middle, and end. And they were to include the thoughts and feelings that they experienced while doing that activity, and to be sure and write at least 6 sentences. So the aspect of art that kind of influenced this lesson was just like the feel that you got, or the aesthetic of the painting, that kind of made you feel like happy and like wintry and seasonal and that kind of a thing. And so we were kind of channeling that in when talking about the assignment and when thinking about planning the lesson. So it was just the overall look and feel of the painting that influenced this lesson. So the rubric or the assessment for this is another rubric also worth 10 points. And so 1 point is for participation in art criticism group discussion, which would have been the beginning answering of questions on like what the painting made them feel. For 3 points would be the participation in turn and talk with their wintertime activity with their partner, and then for 6 points it would be a 6-sentence paragraph that about a wintertime activity that includes details, emotions, and order sequence with a beginning, middle, and end, and closure. So they're writing a short narrative about their wintertime activity. The next lesson was the math lesson that had to do with the art principle component. And in the math lesson, I pointed out that there were a lot of people in the painting. So a lot of the same thing. So a lot of people. And so I would tell the class that we found earlier that there were about 20 visible people in the painting in the foreground, but people come and go to the park all day. And so how many people would be there if 33 more skaters came to the skate park? How many people at the park if 15 people left? So just kind of like creating little math equations with addition and subtraction based on what was going on in the painting. So that's how I would connect the painting to the math component. So then I would tell them that they needed to individually solve 3 word problems at their tables, and once everyone was finished, they can share and compare their answers. So they need to make sure that they solve their problems using pictures, numbers, and words. And so the 3 math problems are there were 21 skaters in Central Park, 13 people were sledding, and 10 people were on the bridge. How many total people were in Central Park? So that's the first one. The second one is there were 84 total people in Central Park, 37 people left to go back home. How many people were left in Central Park after the people left? That was the second math problem. And then the third one is there were 76 people in Central Park on a nice Saturday afternoon. 24 more people came to the park. How many total people were at the park? So that's the third question. So you can see that all of the exam questions had to do with the painting and with the activities that were going on in the painting. And then here's another, this is another rubric for the math lesson, and it's also for 10 points total. So 3 points are that they correctly solved the first word problem. 3 points were that they correctly solved the second word problem. 3 points were that they correctly solved the third word problem, all using pictures, numbers, and words. And then they get 1 point for sharing their findings with their table. So that is the math lesson. Then if we go on into the art project that has to do with math, or that is kind of coming off of the math lesson, the visual art standard for that is creating, conceiving, and developing new artistic ideas and work, or the anchor standard number 1, which is to generate and conceptualize artistic ideas and work. So with the math project, they are to do a watercolor landscape scene similar to the skating in Central Park landscape scene, and their requirements are that they need to include at least 5 to 7 different details. That can be people or plants or animals. And then the idea behind all of that is to later be able to build off their own paintings and possibly create math problems with the objects that they create. So it would be a watercolor painting, and then they would have either 5 to 7 of the same thing. So it could be people or trees or animals or something like that to use in the future. And then they have a rubric for that, and to get the full amount of points, which would be 8 to 10 points, the watercolor painting portrayed a landscape scene using clear colors, lines, and shapes, and added details, at least 5 to 7, such as humans, animals, and plants, and the painting was proportionate and had sense of unity. There is a clear foreground, middle ground, and background. So that is the art project that comes off of the math lesson. And then the last lesson that I wrote was a science lesson that was also an art principle component. And we talked about, so the part of the art, the painting that we used was seasons. So it was very clear that in the painting it was winter time. So we I kind of went off that for the lesson. So I told the class that we could agree that the season portrayed in the piece of art is winter, and I kind of asked them how did they know that. So I told them to focus on the changes in the environment that you see. So in the painting you see ice, barren trees or trees with no leaves, snow on the ground, and dimmer lighting in the sky. And those are 4 identifiable changes in the environment that indicate the winter season. So then their assignment was to create a seasonal landscape scene by drawing a season besides winter, because that was already in the painting. Then I wanted them to draw the scene and label at least 4 identifiable aspects that show a change in the environment. So these changes could be changes in the weather, plants, animals, or humans. So once they create and label their drawing, I wanted them to share with their table group, explaining to them the changes that occurred in the environment that indicate a change of season. So they could do fall, spring, summer, anything but winter. And the rubric for that is also worth 10 full points. So this is the written rubric. For 4 points, they successfully drew a seasonal landscape with at least 4 identifiable changes specific to the season. For another 4 points, they successfully labeled the 4 identifiable changes in the picture drawn, and they are accurate and appropriate changes. And then for 2 points, they shared and explained their drawing and labels to their table group. So that was the science lesson and assessment.